So let me begin with a quote from Lewis. The quote goes, quote, "All that is not eternal is eternally out of date," unquote. 50 years after his passing, what is it about C.S. Lewis that has made him so influential? Here I want to first recommend a new DVD entitled C.S. Lewis, Why He Matters Today, from our friends at Asbury University, including Devin Brown, who many of you may know. And I've taken the liberty of using some of their excellent discussion and wording in the preliminary portion of my talk today. For me, Lewis provided a clear articulation of what it means to be a Christian in his own life and in the lives of anyone who reads his work. He demonstrated what it means to be a Christian in today's modern world. For Lewis, Christianity was something that captured the mind, fired the imagination, and filled the heart. And becoming a Christian changed the way he viewed the world in 4 respects. Number 1, Lewis showed that reason is the anchor of faith. By presenting a defense of the Christian faith that appealed to reason, Lewis removed obstacles of faith that most people in our world face today. By restoring reason to its proper place, Lewis showed how Christianity could appeal to those earnestly seeking answers to the great questions of life. As Lewis noted, quote, "Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. He wants a child's heart, but a grown-up's head," unquote. Number 2, Lewis punctured the pomposity and the pretension of modern elite intellectuals. For example, Lewis revealed that you cannot trust your own reason if we are solely the product of random chance through evolution. Lewis had faith and reason in which Christianity is both faithful and rational. Number 3, Lewis noted that reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. The concept of story or narrative or meta-narrative, as you well know, was crucial to Lewis. He showed that Christian imagination could expand our sense of what's possible. Christian imagination could re-enchant a world that has been disenchanted by limited possibilities of modernism and scientism. Modernism is the view of the post-Enlightenment, i.e., the view that up until that time, societies were held back by the superstitions, the narrow-mindedness of religion, especially Christianity. The Enlightenment was the enlightening concept that reason alone would get us everywhere, that we could unpack the world around us, not inhibited by the past. And out of that comes a whole number of things that we'll talk about that Lewis was very concerned about. Scientism is the view that the only thing that's true is what you can scientifically measure. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Number 4, Lewis restored a Christian vision of humanity, the eternal destiny of every human being. As a result, Lewis fought against the dehumanizing aspects of modern culture. Now, Lewis was, as I'm sure all of you know, he was many things. He was a novelist, he was a poet, he was a scholar, a medievalist, a literary critic, essayist, theologian, a Christian apologist. He held academic positions at Oxford and at Cambridge. He's best known, of course, for his fiction, especially the Chronicles of Narnia and the Screwtape Letters, the Space Trilogy perhaps, and for his Christian apologetics, especially Mere Christianity and the Problem of Pain. But I would like to discuss today, Lewis's influence goes far further, and this reflects a more profoundly relevant worldview for modern man that critiques modernism. So let's sort of inventory what we see around us about Lewis. To give a more complete picture of Lewis's influence, his books have been translated into about 40 languages. Not every one, but many of them, and have sold millions. The books that make up the Chronicles of Narnia, first published in 1950 through 1954, have sold the most and have been popularized on stage, TV, radio, and cinema, and estimates range from 100 to 150 million sets. The reason we don't know exactly is because the publisher and the estate doesn't divulge the actual information. We do know, however, that Mere Christianity, since 2001, has sold about 3 million copies, and the Screwtape Letters, since 2001, have sold about 2 million copies, and roughly, Lewis's books sell about 3 to 6 million a year. In all, there are about 110 authored or edited books of Lewis's work, and at last count, 242 books that discuss him and his work, with new ones all the time. The combined box office sales of the 3 Narnia films totals $1.5 billion, and that doesn't include TV or DVD and Blu-ray sales. Incidentally, the total budget for the 3 films to produce them was $560 million. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the highest grossing. It actually ranks as the 49th highest grossing film of all time. And the film series is ranked as the 24th highest series of all time. Until the Harry Potter series, the 7 volumes of Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia book series were the most influential children's books in the world, voted successfully by teachers and parents and librarians and others as the most important books for children. But interestingly enough, the Potter series haven't cut into the Narnia market. In fact, they've greatly expanded as sales of the Narniad has increased by 20% during the Potter phenomenon. They're also about, according to Douglas Gresham, one of Lewis's stepsons, there are approximately 300 C.S. Lewis societies in the world. On our website, C.S. Lewis Society of California, you can actually go to the links page and you'll find these are all the ones we know about. There's also the C.S. Lewis Foundation, the C.S. Lewis Institute. There are numerous C.S. Lewis centers at colleges and universities, and hopefully a future C.S. Lewis college. Clearly, Lewis has gone far beyond his assessment of what his future influence would be, and it continues to grow. But again, what accounts for it? And as with Lewis, we live in an increasingly secularized world. Lewis was rebelling against. He was a radical in the academic world and in the popular culture. We live in a secularized world of massive and pervasive nation states, which is also a modern phenomenon. And in this world, as I was saying, traditional religion, especially Christianity, is ruled as unwelcome and even a danger on the basis of a purported history of intolerance and, quote, religious violence, unquote. This is found in most all public domains, including the institutions of education, business, government, welfare, transportation, parks and recreation, science, art, foreign affairs, economics, entertainment, and the media. That's pretty extensive. A secularized public square policed by government is viewed as providing a neutral, rational, free, and safe domain, and keeps the quote-unquote irrational forces of religion from creating darkness and conflict. And we were told that real progress requires expanding this domain by pushing religion, especially Christianity, ever backward into remote corners of society where it will have little or no influence. In short, modern America has become a secular theocracy with a civic religion of national politics, nationalism, occupying the public realm in which government has replaced God. For Lewis, this view was fatally flawed, and this is what he came to realize when he became a Christian. It was fatally flawed morally, intellectually, and spiritually, producing the 20th century rise, as far as Lewis was concerned, and also Tolkien, his best friend, the 20th century rise of the total state, the total war, and mega genocides. They believed it was directly tied to this secularization of the West. For Lewis, Christianity provided the one true and coherent worldview that applied to all human aspirations. As he noted, quote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else," unquote. Now, in his book, The Discarded Image, Lewis revealed that for medieval Christians, there was no secular, sacred split, and that this unified theopolitical worldview of hope, joy, liberty, justice, and purpose from the loving grace of God enabled us to discover the objective natural law principles of ethics, science, and theology, which produced an immense human flourishing. Lewis described the natural law as a cohesive and interconnected objective standard of right behavior, and this is how he described it. Quote, "This thing that I have called for convenience the Tao." This is from the Abolition of Man. The Tao, T-A-O. And by the word Tao, he doesn't mean Taoism. He means Tao as in the way. Jesus is the way. And which others may call natural law or traditional morality or first principles of practical reason or first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all values are rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. There's never been, and there never will be, a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. What purports to be new systems, or as they now are called, ideologies, all consist of fragments from the Tao itself, arbitrarily wrenched from their context in the whole and then swollen to madness in their isolation, yet still owing to the Tao, and to it alone with validity as they possess. If my duty to my parents is a superstition, then so is my duty to posterity. If justice is a superstition, then so is my duty to my country or my race or my family. If the pursuit of scientific knowledge is a real value, then so is conjugal fidelity. In another book by the Christian sociologist Rodney Stark called The Victory of Reason, Stark further shows how Christianity led to freedom, free markets, and the success of the West, unquote. In the same way, and prior to the rise of the secular nation state in America, the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville documented in his 1835 volume, The Democracy in America, the remarkable flexibility, vitality, and cohesion of Christian-rooted liberty in America, with business enterprises, churches and societies, covenants, and other private institutions. In other words, instead of the government directing society, civil society created institutions that were private that provided these services, all services, education, welfare, business, etc. In another book called The Myth of Religious Violence, subtitled Secular Ideology and the Roots of Modern Conflict, the Christian scholar William Cavanaugh similarly notes that for Augustine in the ancient world, religion was not a distinct realm separate from the secular. The origin of the term religion, or religio, from the Latin, came from ancient Greek, which means to rebind or relink, religar, as a serious obligation for a person in the natural law, religio for me, not only as a shrine, but also a civic oath and family rituals that most Westerners would today consider secular. In the Middle Ages, Aquinas further viewed religio not as a set of private beliefs, but instead a devotion toward moral excellence in all spheres. Moral excellence meaning the virtues. However, in the Renaissance, after the Middle Ages, religion became viewed as a quote-unquote private impulse, distinct from secular politics, economics, and science. This modern view of religion began the decline of the church as the public communal practice of virtue, of religio. And by the Enlightenment, John Locke, who was also a Christian, by the way, but John Locke had distinguished between the outward force of civil authority and the inward persuasion of religion. He believed that civil harmony required a strict division between the state, whose interests were public, and the church, whose interests are private, thereby clearing the public square for the purely secular. For Locke, the church is a voluntary society of men, quote unquote, but obedience to the state is mandatory. Quite different from what Tocqueville wrote about. The subsequent rise of the modern state in claiming a monopoly of violence, lawmaking, and public allegiance within a given territory depended upon either absorbing the church into the state or relegating the church to a private realm. A little further explanation of how deep this viewpoint goes. For Enlightenment figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who dismissed natural law as in the Thomist tradition, all American founders believed in natural law and so on. But for Rousseau, natural law was to be dismissed. Civic religion, as in democratic regimes, quote, is a new creation that confers sacred status on democratic institutions and symbols, unquote. And their influential writings, Edward Gibbon, who was the author of The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, and Voltaire, claimed that the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries were, quote, the last gap of medieval barbarism and fanaticism before the darkness was dispelled. Now, Gibbon and Voltaire believed that after the Reformation divided Christendom among religious grounds, Protestants and Catholics began killing each other for more than a century, demonstrating the inherent danger of quote-unquote public religion. The alleged solution was the modern state, in which religious loyalties were uprooted, the state secured a monopoly of violence. Henceforth, religious fanaticism would be tamed, uniting all in loyalty to the secular state. However, this is what William Cavanaugh calls the myth of religious violence, something that Lewis also was well aware of. Now here's the clincher on this. The link between state building and war in the modern era has been well documented. One of the most famous historians in the world did it. His name is Charles Tilly. He said, quote, war made the state and the state made war, unquote. In the actual period of European state building, the arise of the nation state, the most serious cause of violence and the central factor in the growth of the state was the attempt to collect taxes from an unwilling populace, with local elites resisting the state building efforts of kings and emperors, not religion. And if you go back and see what the disputes were, you'd find Protestants siding with Catholics. In other words, it doesn't fit the model of the post-Enlightenment anti-religious crusaders. In fact, the absorption of the church in the state that began well before the Reformation was crucial to the rise of the state and wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. Nevertheless, Voltaire distinguished between state religion and theological religion, of which a state religion can never cause any turmoil. This is not true of theological religion, he said. It is the source of all the follies and turmoils imaginable. It is the mother of fanaticism and civil discord. It is the enemy of mankind. What Rousseau proposed instead was to supplement the purely private religion of man with a civil or political religion intended to bind the citizen to the state. Quote, "As for the man who, having committed himself publicly to the state's articles of faith, acts of any occasion as if he does not believe them, let his punishment be death. He has committed the greatest of all crimes. He has lied in the presence of the laws. So the death penalty to whoever is not secular." And these are people who are enlightened, are tolerant. So I'm trying to suggest that the roots of the secular theocracy today go back. And yet, if you look at the new atheist views, you'll find that this is their view. So as a result, the Enlightenment set in motion what has become today's secular theocracy. It's authoritarian, it's hypocritical, for not just its denial of moral condemnation. It will not condemn secular violence, but it's hypocritical because it exalts such violence as highly praiseworthy. It's the highest calling. Lewis realized that this serious problem in ways that precious few Christian leaders have for the past 200 years. This is one of the most important reasons, I believe, why Lewis has had an influence. He sets apart from not just the secular world, but much of the Christian world, especially the Protestant world. I'm not Catholic, but I'm just making this point. For Lewis, either Christianity applied to everything in the world, and indeed the universe, or it applied to nothing. Unfortunately, for decades, some Christians, both conservative and liberal, have embraced what is often called a progressive view, which is actually an authoritarian view. And the view is that we should wield intrusive government powers as an unquestionable and even sanctified calling for both domestic and international matters, abandoning the Christian natural law tradition in both ethics and economics. In contrast, Lewis did not suffer such delusions. For example, in 1951, Winston Churchill was re-elected as British Prime Minister, and within weeks, he approached Lewis offering to have him knighted as a commander of the Order of the British Empire. Lewis flatly declined the honor. He declined it because he was not interested in politics, was deeply skeptical of government power and politicians, as expressed in the first two lines of one of his poems. The poem is entitled, quote, "Lines During a General Election," unquote. Here's the two lines, quote, "Their threats are terrible enough, but we bear all that. It is their promises that bring despair," unquote. Earlier in 1940, Lewis had written a letter to his brother Warren, or Warney, quote, "Could one start a stagnation party, which at general elections would boast not that during its terms of office, no event of the least importance would occur," unquote. He further stated, "I was by nature against government." However, while such contemporary Christians who embrace the secular state, or at least defer to the secular state, have clamored for the notion of social justice or the end justifies the means and so on, the question is, when Lewis was rebelling against this, was he just ignorant or naive of the modern realities? Or was he aiming at a deeper and more significant purpose? And that's what I want to briefly outline for you here. Lewis was profoundly interested in the ideas and institutions that were the basis for free and virtuous individuals and communities. He wrote numerous books. The Narniad idea of the deep magic and the deeper magic is the natural law. But he was not at all interested in partisanship or campaign politics. Instead, he focused on first principles, and public policy matters were only of interest if they pertained to questions of enduring value. As a result, while the work of most modern scholars and other writers quickly become dated and obsolete, Lewis's work has achieved an increasing timelessness and relevance. It doesn't become dated, a major reason why his work did not become obsolete after he died. Throughout his work, Lewis infused an interconnected worldview that championed objective truth, moral ethics, natural law, literary excellence, reason, science, individual liberty, personal responsibility and virtue, and Christian theism. These were all one package. And in so doing, he critiqued naturalism, reductionism, nihilism, positivism, scientism, historicism, collectivism, atheism, statism, coercive egalitarianism, militarism, welfarism, and dehumanization and tyranny of all forms. You'll find it throughout his work. And unlike crusaders for government power, economically and socially, over the peaceful choices of people, Lewis stated the following, quote, "I do not like the pretensions of government, the grounds on which it demands my obedience, to be pitched too high. I don't like the medicine man's magical pretensions, nor the Bourbon's divine right. This is not solely because I disbelieve in magic and in Boisseau's politique. I believe in God, but I detest theocracy. For every government consists of mere men and is strictly viewed a makeshift. If it adds to its commands, "Thus saith the Lord," it lies, and it lies dangerously, unquote. Lewis not only addressed the evils of totalitarianism as manifested in fascism and communism, and you'll see that also in many of his books, but the more subtle forms that face us on a daily basis, particular small choices that people make, local choices. For example, this is Lewis again, quote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, but his cupidity may at some point be satisfied. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell on earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which may not regard as disease is to be put on the level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals," unquote. Throughout Lewis's books, he defended the rights and sanctity of individuals against tyranny, not just because he opposed evil, but because he considered life and freedom, including both social and economic freedom, to be essential. Quote, "I believe a man is happier and happy in a richer way if he had the freeborn mind. But I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence, which the new society is abolishing. For economic independence allows an education not controlled by the government, and in adult life, it is the man who needs and asks nothing of government, who can criticize its acts and snap his fingers at its ideology. Read Montaigne. That's the voice of a man with his legs under his own table, eating the mutton and turnips raised on his own land. Who will talk like that when the state is everyone's schoolmaster and employer?" Again, going back to Rodney Stark in his book, The Victor of Reason, Stark points out that the idea of self, or individual, and free will had been discussed by Cicero and others before the Christian era, but it was not until Jesus personally asserted in words and deeds the universal moral concept, the universal moral equality before and responsibility to God, and not until Christian theologians made it a central tenet of their doctrine that the rights of each and every individual were championed and slavery was condemned. And Stark had pointed out that although almost every other culture and religion viewed human society in terms of the tribe, the polis, or collective, quote, "It is the individual who was the focus of Christian political thought, and this in turn explicitly shaped the views of later European political philosophers," unquote. This point produced a radical change in a world in which, despite notable but limited exceptions of political decentralization, slavery, infanticide, and nearly universal and unyielding despotism had ruled throughout the entire world, where people were treated as mere members of a group owned by the rulers. With Christianity, however, each and every person was a sacred, holy object who has free will and is individually responsible for the choices he or she makes. As Thomas Aquinas stated, quote, "A man can direct and govern his own actions also. Therefore, the rational creature participates in the divine providence, not only in being governed, but also in governing." So in this regard, Lewis stressed the importance of the natural law of moral ethics, a code of moral conscience that is inescapable and defines every person as human. Such morality exists on its own independent and subjective choices of experience, just as one may grasp the inherent truism of mathematics or natural physical laws such as gravity. Now, Lewis drew on the natural law insights of many thinkers, including St. Paul, Augustine, Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, Cicero, Grotius, Blackstone, Acton, Locke, and so on. And he considered the modernist dismissals of such work. And you may have noticed that many of these writers are part of the great books core, by the way, that the C.S. Lewis College would have. Lewis believed that the modernist dismissal of such work to be fundamentally erroneous. In particular, both Aquinas' notion of what Aquinas called common sense, as he described in his book Summa Theologia, and the legacy of rational theism found in Jewish, Islamic, Christian, and certain pagan writers, the core philosophical system of the West, had a powerful effect on Lewis. Because remember, Lewis was a medieval and Renaissance scholar, so he was well versed in the whole field. And to him, the culture of modernism is not just an historical aberration against common sense, but a profound threat to the pursuit of truth, beauty, goodness, and civilization itself. To Lewis, civilization is grounded in the truths that come from God, the natural law tradition. So this common sense, or Lewis's notion of common rationality, consisted in part on the intrinsic understanding of each individual as a human being, of an objective, universal, and natural legal code of truth and morality. For Lewis, each individual responds to and can come to know and experience the external reality of this truth. It is a common knowledge. This insight is similar to what Adam Smith wrote about in his 1959 book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So Lewis claimed that, quote, if a man will go into a library and spend a few days with the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, he will soon discover the massive unanimity of the practical reason of man. From the Babylonian hymn to Somos, from the laws of Manu, the Book of the Dead, the Analects of Confucius, the Stoics, the Platonists, from Australian Aborigines, he will collect the same triumphantly monotonous denunciation of oppression, murder, treachery, and falsehood, the same injunctions of kind and to the aged, the young, and the weak, of almsgiving and impartiality and honesty. Isn't that amazing? This is before mass communications. These are people who'd had no knowledge that even each other existed in many respects. He may be a little surprised to find that precepts of mercy are far more frequent than precepts of justice, but he would no longer doubt that there is such a thing as the law of nature. There are, of course, differences. There are even blindnesses in particular cultures, just as there are savages who cannot count up to 20. But the pretense that we are presented with a mere chaos, though no outline of universally accepted values shows through, is simply false and should be contradicted in season and out of season wherever it is met. Far from finding a chaos, we find exactly what we should expect if good is indeed something objective and reason the organ by where it is apprehended. That is a substantial agreement with considerable local differences of emphasis and perhaps no code that includes everything. So for Lewis, this natural law tradition was central. If you break the natural law, you sin. That's what sin is. The Decalogue prohibits killing and stealing and adultery. If you break those, you sin. And every society, as Lewis was saying, has this tradition. To the extent they adopt it and follow it, they're civil. They have a civil society that functions. To the extent they break it, they've got problems. Lewis, in the course of seeing this universal knowledge of the natural law, he was rejecting the idea that only those who are Christian could understand or be moral, because a natural law is fundamental to human existence. It's marked on every heart. Lewis argued for the existence of natural law is known to everyone. As Paul stated, quote, when Gentiles do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bear witness, and their thoughts, now accusing, now even defending them. So, the implications of this are what? My suggestion is Lewis was influential because his relevance is even deeper than most people are realizing. He's talking about how we live our lives, how in the new creation, which begins when you become a Christian, now, eternity begins now. And so we are called to minister to others in everything, in commerce, in family. Essentially, when Jesus asked, what is Caesar's and what is God's? What is Caesar's? Is there anything that's Caesar's that's not God's? So, the first issue here that most of you are aware of is that the natural law position is a strict critique of moral relativism and what would be called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism means that instead of there being an objective standard of what is true or good, we sort of weigh things. We say, well, on the one hand this, on the one hand that, we're going to add it up, and then we choose. So the end justifies the means. We pick different means as long as the end is what we think we're going to get. And Lewis's point is, not only does that create enormous chaos as far as the value system is concerned, but it's actually a contradiction. Because if you say that the end justifies the means, that means there's some standard that you judge the means by. But the standard doesn't simply magically pop up when the end occurs. The standard is also there for every means. And when you have a means, at the end, the means are still there. In other words, let's say that you want to feed the poor. And to feed the poor, you're going to knock over gas stations to do it, right? Well, you can feed the poor, but at the time you're feeding the poor, the gas stations had still been knocked off, right? That sin has still been created, has to be dealt with. So Jesus taught the end never justifies the means, because every means is the key. In fact, the means is the question of sin. You can't just use any means to do what you want, regardless of how noble your aim might be. So Lewis claimed that the precepts of moral ethics are not up for grabs. They cannot just be innovated, they cannot be improvised. So Lewis's point is that picking and choosing among the code of the Tao, again, this idea of the way, the natural law, is inherently foolish and harmful. He notes, for example, that attempts to base moral ethics as a product of a physicalism of survival instinct, in a Darwinian sense, you might say, has a profound dilemma. On the one hand, the utilitarian, or as Lewis calls that person, the innovator in the abolition of man, The utilitarian tries to make judgments on the value of human choices by claiming that one decision is good or not. But on what basis is this valuation made? If the only standard that exists is instinct, Lewis shows that all such valuations necessarily must use an objective standard of the Tao to do so, even if only partially. As a natural law proponent, Lewis was a supporter of what's called the law of equal liberty. But he was a firm critic of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism means equality of outcome, which can be, again, imposed by using force, because the end justifies the means to do that. Lewis was a big advocate of merit. He believed that it was merit should be the basis of how you're rewarded. He had a talk that he gave at the commencement once at King's College in London to the graduating class, which is called The Inner Ring. Okay, the Inner Ring basically is about this issue of ends and means. Lewis hence understood that without the necessary natural law framing of social, legal, and political culture, mankind could no longer be recognized as worthy of rights or common decency, but instead left defenseless to any all forms of oppression. In the scientific Brave New World, the citizen and government become slave, and exactly what Lewis critiqued in his essay, Is Progress Possible? Willing Slaves to the Welfare State, which you can find in his book, God in the Dock. Of course, what all this means is the elimination of what makes mankind human in the first place, as Lewis notes. Quote, "The question has become whether we can discover any way of submitting to the worldwide paternalism of a technocracy without losing all personal privacy and independence. Is there any possibility of getting the super welfare state's honey and avoiding the sting? Let us make no mistake about the sting. To live his life in his own way, to call his house his castle, to enjoy the fruits of his own labor, to educate his children as his conscience directs, to save for their prosperity after his death, these are all wishes deeply ingrained in civilized man," unquote. And this theme recurs throughout Lewis's work, including in both his fiction and his nonfiction. So this theme is everywhere, and here's an example in one of his fiction work. Those of you who've read the Space Trilogy, or at least the third volume, which is called That Hideous Strength, he describes a disturbing world in which a scientific elite creates a totalitarian system in order to coercively engineer a new mankind via what's called the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or NICE. The bureaucrats and planners of NICE are exactly what he earlier attacked in his masterly book, The Abolition of Man. That Hideous Strength is the fiction version of The Abolition of Man, or vice versa. They both came out the same year, by the way. And in his novel, The Screwtape Letters, the demonic Screwtape instructs his pupil Wormwood to mislead his human patient by using the convoluted progress concept of social justice in order to twist what appears to be good into evil and seduce the person into sin. Here's Screwtape. Quote, "On the other hand, we do want, and want very much, to make men treat Christianity as a means, preferably, of course, as a means to their own advancement, but failing that, as a means to anything, even to social justice. The thing to do is to get a man at first to value social justice as a thing which the enemy, God, demands, and then work him on to the stage at which he values Christianity because it may produce social justice. For the enemy will not be used as a convenience," unquote. I mentioned before Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, and Lewis was not only interested in de Tocqueville's work, but he was also interested, as I mentioned before, in the work of Lord Acton, the British historian. And many of you may be familiar with a very famous quote by Lord Acton, which you'll find in Lewis's work in many of his essays. And the quote is, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So Lewis believed in what we called self-government. People coming together and forming common agreements to secure common ends, but not to coerce people in the process, because the end never justifies the means. So America's founders, even though it's a variation in their views, all basically had the same view, all right? And it was pushing aside the natural law basis of the founders' view, which resulted in the rise of the nation state in the United States, and the view that the Constitution is irrelevant, and so on and so forth. So here's Lewis on why he says that, as in the spirit of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America of radical decentralization of power, he views himself to be a Democrat because I believe in the fall of man. Quote, "I think most people are Democrats for the opposite reason. A great deal of democratic enthusiasm descends from the ideas of people like Rousseau, who believed in democracy because they thought mankind so wise and good that everyone deserved a share in the government. The danger of defending democracy on those grounds is that they're not true. And whenever their weakness is exposed, the people who prefer tyranny make capital out of the exposure. I find they're not true without looking further than myself. I don't deserve a share in governing a henhouse, much less a nation, nor do most people. All the people believe in advertisement, and I think in catchwords and spread rumors. The real reason for democracy is just the reverse. Man is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. Aristotle said that some people were only fit to be slaves. I do not contradict him, but I reject slavery because I see no men fit to be masters. And in a similar way, in his book, In the Weight of Glory, sermon I should mention, he noted the need to radically constrain the power of government, quoting Lord Acton's axiom, quote, I believe in political equality, but there are two opposite reasons for being a Democrat. You may think all men so good that they deserve a share in the government of the Commonwealth, and so wise that the Commonwealth needs their advice. That is, in my opinion, the false romantic doctrine of democracy. On the other hand, you may believe fallen men to be so wicked that not one of them can be trusted with any irresponsible power over his fellows. Thus, I believe to be the true ground of democracy. I do not believe that God created an egalitarian world. Since we have sin, we have found, as Lord Acton says, that all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The only remedy has been to take away the powers and substitute a legal fiction of equality. Theocracy has been rightly abolished, not because it is bad that priests should govern ignorant laymen, but because priests are wicked men like the rest of us. There's no exception. We all sin. And he went further, saying, quote, I detest every kind of religious compulsion. Only the other day, I was writing an angry letter to the Spectator about church parades in the Home Guard, unquote. But Lewis fully understood that if unchecked democracy became egalitarianism, in other words, forcibly redistributing power and merit and whatever, trampling on liberty as a collectivist force for evil by celebrating pride and envy as it fosters tyranny. Let's go back to Screwtape. This is from the sequel to the Screwtape letters, the essay Screwtape Proposes a Toast, which incidentally first appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, 10 years after the book was published. Quote, hidden in the heart of this striving for liberty, there was also a deep hatred of personal freedom. That invaluable man Rousseau first revealed it. In his Perfect Democracy, only the state religion is permitted. Again, exactly what William Cavanaugh was saying about the origins of the modern state and what Voltaire and others were saying. Only the state religion is permitted, slavery was restored, and the individual is told that he is really willed, though he does not know it, whatever the government tells him to do. From that starting point, via Hegel, another indispensable propagandist on our side, on the Screwtape side, we easily contrive both the Nazi and the communist state. Even in England, we were pretty much successful. I heard the other day that in that country, a man could not, without permit, cut down his own tree with his own axe, make it into planks with his own saw, and use the planks to build a tool shed on his own garden. Democracy is the word with which you must lead them by the nose. And of course, it is connected with the political ideal that men should be equally treated. You then make a stealthy transition in their minds from this political ideal to a factual belief that all men are equal. Under the name of envy, it has been known to humans for thousands of years, but hitherto they always regarded it as the most odious and also the most comical of vices. Dunces and idlers must not be made to feel inferior to intelligent and industrial pupils. That would be undemocratic. And anyway, the teachers, or should I say nurses, will be far too busy reassuring the dunces and patting them on the back to waste any time on real teaching. Again, this is Screwtape talking. This would not follow unless all education became state education. Penal taxes designed for that purpose are liquidating the middle class, the class who are prepared to save and spend and make sacrifices in order to have their children privately educated. The overthrow of free people and the multiplication of slave states are for us a means, besides of course being fun, but the real end is the destruction of the individual. I'm as good as you is a useful means for the destruction of democratic societies. But it has a far deeper value as an end in itself, as a state of mind which necessarily excludes humility, charity, contentment, and all the pleasures of gratitude and admiration, turns a human being away from the almost every word, every road, which might finally lead him to heaven. So Screwtape considers this to be a strategically important way to send people to hell. So in concluding, in direct contrast to the moral relativism, utilitarianism, collectivism, and authoritarians of modernism, lessons from Lewis in his extensive writings pertain to liberty are really clear. He believed that liberty is part of the Christian worldview. It was an essential thing. God made us free with free will to choose good or evil. If God chooses it for us, it has no meaning. And we have to listen with our heart to follow God in the process. Here's Lewis again. Quote, it is in man's power to treat himself as a mere natural object and his judgments of value as raw material for scientific manipulation to alter at will. The real objection is that if man chooses to treat himself as raw material, if man believes that he's just matter, raw material he will be, not raw material to be manipulated, as he fondly imagined, by himself, but by mere appetite, that is, mere nature, in the person of his dehumanized conditioners. Either we are rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute value of the Tao, the natural law, or else we are mere nature to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters who must, by hypothesis, have no motive but their own natural impulses, and only the Tao provides a common human law of nature which can overarch rulers and those ruled alike. This is probably one of the most famous statements in his book, The Abolition of Man. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule, which is not tyranny, or an obedience which is not slavery. The process which, if unchecked, will abolish man goes on apace among communists and Democrats, no less among fascists. The methods may at first differ in brutality, but many a mild-eyed scientist in pince-nez, many a popular dramatist, many an amateur philosopher in our midst means in the long run just the same as the Nazi rulers of Germany. It's a pretty harsh statement, but that's at the end of his book, The Abolition of Man. In Lewis's book series, The Chronicles of Narnia, the land of Narnia is held in place by the sacred deep magic, the natural law. And to transgress this moral code is the mark of evil. Toward the end of his book in the series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book, which was made in the highly successful 2005 film some of you may have seen, the children Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy assume the rightful thrones as kings and queens of Narnia. To do what? To enforce the deep magic. Lewis describes how they governed themselves during the golden age of Narnia and their most important accomplishments. Quote, and they made good laws, and they kept the peace, and saved good trees from being cut down, and liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. So the interesting thing about Lewis is that Lewis is not saying that Christianity is just church-going, mission work, whatever. It's everything in civil society, it's in economics, it's in the family, it's in everything that we do. So I think the key thing that we want to learn from this is that the Christian worldview is far more powerful than even many of our good friends who are Christians can imagine, who have actually deferred to the secular state. And Lewis is not saying that we should take over the secular state. He's saying what we want to do is we want to destatize society and return to a standard that's natural law based.